I shared my show, which was the hardest, my story. And then I'm like, I'm going to go into anger because everybody's like so uncomfortable with anger. And I need people to know that this is okay. And so, I don't know, I think it was just around, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, but there's also the gifts of the suffering and the gifts of what I've learned and how I've transformed it. And I can appreciate those gifts, even though I would give all of them back to have them back.
Welcome to The Courage Effect. I'm Suzanne Weller, and this is a show about growth and unleashing what's possible. You will hear inspiring stories about what courage looks like, how we navigate what's getting in our way, and the opportunities that surface when we choose courage over comfort. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Courage Effect. It's Suzanne. My guest today is April McCormick, and I honestly couldn't think of a better way to round out a year of inspiring conversations than this one. Let me tell you a little bit about her before I share our conversation with you. April McCormick is a wife, mother, coach, and senior manager for flight test engineering at a major aerospace company, where she leads teams through complex challenges. However, her greatest test of courage came with the sudden loss of her first son, Lincoln. This experience led her on a transformative journey, shaping her approach to management and life. She now uses her story to inspire others, hosting the podcast Uncomfortable Friend and serving as a parent advisor at Seattle Children's Hospital. In the conversation you're about to hear, April goes through the experience of losing her son. She talks more about that in a specific episode of her podcast Uncomfortable Friend, which I highly recommend you take some time to listen to. What you'll also hear in this conversation is what a remarkable human and leader she is. She talks about her family now, her husband, her 2 children. She goes back into some family history of her mother and really what she has worked through over the past 6 years and how this has impacted her as a human and also to be able to make change in her workplace, to be an incredible leader for the people that look to her every day so that she can take those experiences and use them for good. She finds meaning in the pain and turns it into something truly inspirational and really quite beautiful. It is a moving conversation, and I'm sure that you are going to enjoy it. Her generosity and compassion will seep through your headphones. And for those of you listening today, I'm giving you a bit of a trigger warning. If you are dealing with some acute loss or grief, especially over a family member or a child, this might be something that you want to pace yourself with or listen to at another time. Thank you for being here. April, such a pleasure to have you at The Courage Effect. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
You are somebody that I feel I know better than I actually do because I listen to your podcast on a regular basis. And it's a really beautiful thing. And it's something that I feel like you use the format in just such an honest, lovely, connected way. And it moves me. Every single episode never fails to move me. So I want to start off with that.
Well, that's a huge compliment, especially coming from you, because I always feel like as I'm listening to your episodes, I get a little bit of wisdom in every single one. And I'm like, oh, that's truth. I could feel it. From one person in the podcasting craft to another, that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that we're actually bringing truths to each other because, we have those moments of like, oh, I feel it. It's there's just something there. But I'd love to start off the conversation by really talking to you about courage. I know that courage is something that you have stepped into repeatedly through your life in various ways. But I'd love to hear from you. How do you actually define it?
Yeah. So I define courage as the ability, which we all have, and the willingness to confront pain, grief, discomfort, uncertainty, pretty much any of those feelings or things you can kind of associate it with fear, regardless of the challenge that you're going to face while doing it.
Love that. Talk to me a little bit about the willingness piece, because I know you're really emphasizing that, and we're both coaches. So obviously we practice a lot of this with our clients and who we partner with, but especially as you've gone through the various courageous journeys that you have, what is it for you when you think about willingness?
Yeah. I mean, It was so interesting because growing up, I found my mother was she's a very resilient woman. She's always had this mindset, like, I'll show you, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make it. You know, she came from really humble beginnings, didn't have a father really in the picture, was one of four. And her mother passed when she was a teenager. So, you know, it was a really difficult, trying time. And she pretty much was out on her own and working at 18 and like kind of built her entire life from there. So going from like not always having food on the table to like having to survive on her own at 18, which to me, it's crazy that we think that that's an adult. I know I thought that when I was 18, but now I look back and I'm like, far from it. But she's had so many challenges in her life. And so I grew up with this constant, I think, emphasis of like, you can do it. Like, you know, don't let them show you, like, don't let them beat you down. Like, you know, go and do it. And I don't think it was until I got older and got to reflect on my experiences with both my father and my grandmother, where I realized that not everybody makes that decision. My father had a rough upbringing and didn't really talk about any of that. He was a severe alcoholic and a very abusive person and involved in drugs and things. And, you know, I think now I recognize that it was a numbing mechanism. It was a coping mechanism for him and not wanting to process any of his things. And then my grandmother lost my grandfather, you know, 20 years before she passed. And she went from being this very active, very mobile, very full of life kind of woman, again, like it takes no crap from anybody, to just sitting in a chair, becoming immobile, and spending the last 20 years of her life pretty much chair-bound and housebound. And so I think later on, especially after I went through my largest challenges of losing my son, I looked at them and I said, well, I know what not to do. I looked at the willingness, and my father was never willing to get the help that he needed to be able to stop that numbing exercise. So it kind of just took over his life and really became an awful disease. And my grandmother didn't want to know what life was going to be like without my grandfather and really just shut down. And so it wasn't until then that I recognized that there is a choice in that matter. And my mother was always like, there was no choice. This is just what you do. So it was a really interesting perspective. It was very different.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that, because it's the idea of what you can control, right? Because the idea of we're always like, so much shit's happening in the world, like, I mean, every day we could all just break down and not get anything done and be petrified. And you've looked at that head on. I mean, obviously with the death of your son, but was there a moment for you with Lincoln when you moved into that willingness, where you believe that you made that choice?
For me, I think it was right away, to be quite honest with you. And that maybe I'm very thankful for my mother in the sense that, I think it also is about like my own personal religious and spiritual beliefs. I never knew how great motherhood would be. And I kind of knew I wanted to have a child, or I knew I wanted to have kids. Everybody, you know, kind of, that's the path that one takes, right? Like, you know, that's what you assume. And when I had him, like, the world just changed for me so much. He just taught me so much, and I didn't understand what that kind of love was like. And to this day, like, you know, I honestly do believe he was very much a soulmate for me and completely changed the way that I empathize and helped me gain compassion and patience and lots of beautiful things. And when he died, I don't know, my upbringing, or maybe it's just my own personal beliefs, I'm just like, I can't tap out of this. Like, I can't, like, because I truly believe that we're here to learn, and that Earth and life is a great experiment. And if we don't learn it the first time, we'll get the opportunity to learn it again. And so I'm like, I don't want to go through this again. Yeah. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I don't want to do this again. This is going to be my only time. And then I also doubled down with that. And I said, I don't want to know what my marriage was going to be like without having a child, now that I know what that could be like. And so my husband had to have a lot of patience with me and was very compassionate in the fact that I was just like, I don't want to know what this is. Like, I used a lot of numbing, but in the form of like TV and church and things like that. Mm-hmm. So not as bad as it could be. But I did that knowing that I'm like, I'm going to figure this out. But I just kind of let myself I just knew I didn't want to do this again. So that was my decision to go into courage. I don't think I actually started understanding how to even try to do that until the Christmas season after he passed. He passed in June, and that Christmas, I remember distinctly being on a ferry going to Victoria because I live in the Seattle area, and we did not want to be home for Christmas. It just was not something that we were okay with doing. And that's when I ended up reading Brene Brown's The Gifts of Imperfection. And it felt like it was like the way. Something like I had been praying for was help and trying to figure out, how do I navigate this? I need help. Like soon after he passed, like the next day, we started calling and trying to figure out, how do we get help because we don't know what we're doing here. And we stumbled upon also the Seattle Children's Journey program, which was a free resource for parents who have lost a child. And so we got free grief counseling, both together and separate, to kind of work through our own journey. But those two resources in and of itself, I had prayed for, and I'm like, I just need to know how to survive. And it wasn't about hope for the future. It's weird. I think so many people, especially when something so tragic happens, they want you to focus on the hope, the hope, the hope. I was not ready for hope. Just flat out. Like, I was not ready for hope. I'm like, my world just ended. Life as I knew it. Like they say, when you lose a parent, you lose your past. When you lose a partner, you lose your present. When you lose a child, you lose your future. And I was just like, I'm not ready for hope right now. And it was really around learning some tools and experimenting and finding out what fit and what did not feel right, and being honest about that, and eventually vulnerability, which led me to taking just one small step at a time until I got to the point where I was able to look back and understand what I was doing was courage.
So beautiful for so many reasons. Thank you for that. I mean, as we talked about, I'm a massive Brene Brown fan, which there's no surprise there. And I actually did a course with a coach, with Suzanne, on the gifts of imperfection. And it was like over the course of a couple of months with a group.
Oh, amazing.
It's a life-changing thing.
I think boundaries. I mean, one of the biggest things I learned from that was boundaries, and that I had a voice in that. I also grew up in a very maternal environment where we had a lot of really loud women voices. And I sometimes didn't always feel heard. And I'll never forget, and my aunt and I joke about this now, but that first Christmas, she called me and she's like, "What are you doing for Christmas?" And I'm like, "Nothing." And she said, "Well, you can't do nothing, or you have to decorate." I'm like, "Actually, I don't have to do anything." And it was that first time that I said something like that. And I was like, like, I almost was like, what did I say? And she's like, "You're right. You don't actually have to do anything." And I was so grateful that that was her reaction. And she's one of, a handful of people in my family that have been willing to go on that ride with me and that journey since then. But I didn't know that that was a boundary. I didn't know I was doing that. And I ended up picking and choosing who would I talk to on a holiday versus not. Because what did I have energy for? What did I not? You lose a lot of friends in a grief journey. Some of which were involuntary, and some of them were unfortunately voluntary, in the sense that, like, this relationship right now is too painful. Maybe it could be relived again in the future, or maybe not, but right now it's a no for me. And so I had to learn about boundaries, and a lot of it is around making a choice and seeing if it felt right or not right, and then maybe having to correct if it wasn't right.
Yeah. You're also making me think about, you're talking about your mom and you're talking about your husband. You're all on your own grief journey. And that's the thing that is always so interesting to me is, because you're navigating what you're dealing with, and then everybody else has the things that they really need, and they need to draw their own boundaries too. And it can get really complicated.
Oh, it's so messy. It's so messy. I mean, there were a good 6 months there where my husband and I were really at odds, because the way I showcased a lot of grief was through emotion. And I was very upset, obviously. And for him, not that he didn't grieve Lincoln, he was obviously grieving Lincoln, but we had different experiences. Like, I wasn't physically there when he passed, but my husband was. And so he was grieving that whole process of what had happened. And then he had all this extra, I think any parent who loses a child has a lot of guilt, but he had this whole extra layer of guilt because he was there. And I had this whole layer of guilt because I wasn't there. And sometimes we would say things that felt hurtful to the other because we both wish we were in the different scenarios. And then I also, it was interesting. I started asking some other families that I had met who are unfortunately in our position as well. And I'm seeing a running theme, especially with a husband or more masculine energy in a relationship. And, while he did grieve Lincoln and was sad about Lincoln, I felt like the initial for him was more around me and making sure that I was going to be okay because he could not live without me. He's like, I need you to be okay. And so I think I would get angry because I'm like, why are you not grieving our son the way I'm grieving our son? Like, but it was really more about him trying to take care of me. And so, now 6 years later, I'm watching him trying to now work and process some of that he hasn't had the opportunity to do since then. And it wasn't until growing in this and trying to communicate and getting it wrong sometimes. And then, just being open and continuously putting our hearts out there where we could get to a space where we can understand that now.
Oh, wow. There's so much there. It's just, you're also making me think about finding that synchronicity in those different moments where you're able to ask for what you need, but also show up for what other people need. It's so hard.
I did not show up for others for a long time. I think it was like 6 months after he passed where I realized I had not asked anybody else how they were doing since he died. Everybody would ask me how I was doing, and I did not actually ask anybody else for a good 6 months. And at one point, I remember calling like my best friend from fifth grade, and we still talk together. She's fantastic, Christina. And I remember calling her, and I'm like, I am so sorry, because we both had sons around the same time. So we got married within a month of each other, and we both had our first child around the same time. And at the time, it was really painful. And it wasn't until afterward, and after maybe about a year or two even, where I was talking one day and I asked her about her son, and she's like, are you sure? Are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, no, I want to hear about him. Like, can you send me a picture? Because she's like, he's the same age, it's so painful. And as she finally started to talk to me about her son, as she felt okay to talk about her son with me, I realized I hadn't shown up for her in a way where this is the most important thing in her life. And I haven't asked her about it in years, and the compassion and the grace that takes, like anybody is honored to have at least one friend in their lifetime like that, because I don't know how she did that. I don't know if I could do that. I don't think I could be as good of a friend back with how much I care for my children. So, yeah, it's so complicated.
Yeah. Tell us about your kids now. I'd love to hear. I know you've told me a couple stories about your daughter. I'd love to hear more.
Oh my gosh. So my daughter Ada is 5 and Miles is 3. And Ada, she's funny because I feel like she's been prophesized. My mom, when she would get really angry at me as a kid, she's just like, I hope you have one just like you. And I said, me too.
That's amazing.
I said, me too. And I have her now. And I call my mom and I'm like, you ready for this one? She's like, yep. And I'll tell her the story. She's like, that sounds familiar. And I'm like, I know. So I get lots of flashbacks of being a kid around my daughter, which is really fun. But it was really challenging at first, right? We had her almost a year it was like 3 weeks before the first anniversary of Lincoln's passing. And so that was challenging. Although in some way it actually, I think, eased the pain of that first year a bit, because you're in that new parenthood fog of not like knowing which way is up, and it's the summer and the sun is out. So that's kind of helping a little bit with all the postpartum stuff. And I don't think I had a chance to really process the first year. The second year was really challenging for me because she ended up having a medical issue where she had to have an NG tube to feed when she was 2.5 months old. So I was dealing with that, and she had gone into a failure to thrive situation before that. So I'm like, am I going to lose another one? And spiraling real bad. That was, those first 6 months with Ada was a real spiral for sure. And we've made our way out of that. We've taken one breath, one step, made one choice, like sometimes minute by minute, right? When they say it's like, sometimes the willingness is within like a day, like 1 day at a time, like 1 hour at a time. Sometimes it's a minute at a time. Making it out of that was really challenging. But then we got to the point where she thrived. She didn't need the tube anymore. And I was pregnant. And I'll never forget, I knew it was a boy. I knew wholeheartedly. I I took a pregnancy test and it didn't show positive. And I'm like, I'll give it a week to catch up because I know I'm pregnant. And like, sure enough, like a week later it showed up or whatever. And I told my husband and I'm like, I want to tell everybody, like, I'm so excited. And he's just like, pump the brakes. Like, can we wait until like we're like a little bit further along? Because for my daughter, we waited until we were like 20 weeks along before we said anything. He was still worried, right? He still was in this fear of loss, and he was very protective of Ada, which again, I think is some of the transferring and manifestation of not processing a lot of the grief that he had with our son. But that's when I truly realized that I don't want to just like have something to do or someone to care for the next 60 years until I get to meet Lincoln again. Like Miles was this realization that I actually want to live. Like I want to be in life. Like I want to enjoy these kids. I want to enjoy this time. I want to learn what I have to learn. And boy, do I want to honor Lincoln. He's taught me so much, and I need to honor that because the second worst thing would be that it meant nothing.
I love the book Finding Meaning by David Kessler.
Yes.
The whole idea of the 6th stage of grief. And I think that for me is such a big part of grief, because it's exactly as you said, like you didn't want to skip the steps. You wanted to make sure that you went through it. You didn't want to do it again. And the idea of this pain is going to teach you something, and it's also going to give you some additional meaning on the other side of that.
Yeah, there's a beautiful quote by Father Richard Rohr, and he says, "What's not transformed is transferred." And I think to myself, it's either transferred internally into a pain that you cannot subside. And I think that's what a really large root of a lot of addiction. And what I saw manifest in my father, and depression in my grandmother, and, taking that pain and transforming it into something meaningful, whether it be being in service of others or choosing love instead of fear in a situation. I feel like every single one of those, like my biggest goal is that, when I get to be there, I know he'll be the one that greets me. I want him to be like, good job, Mom. Like, and yeah, and sometimes it's really hard.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. I know we just dove straight into that. So talk about going to the hard stuff. So thank you for that.
I mean, I live in this space. I'm like the most comfortable being uncomfortable in those spaces. So thanks for being just so warm and friendly and allowing the space for it.
Let's take a break. I'd love to take a pause, and when we come back, talk about how courage shows up in your work.
Sounds great.
These are challenging times. Sometimes it can take a good dose of courage just to get out of bed. When life becomes hard, it's vital we seek support from trusted, experienced people. If you're going through a hard time, working with a therapist can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and accessible. It's an online platform where you can be matched with a professional therapist in as little as a few days. You can find out more information and get matched with a therapist at BetterHelp, that's HELP.com/courage. Visiting this link both supports this show and gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. I'm in conversation with April McCormick, and we've been talking about grief, and especially around her podcast, The Uncomfortable Friend. I love that title, by the way. I've heard the phrase like grief is an uncomfortable friend. So before we go into talking more about courage professionally, how did you land on that as the title?
I was thinking around what would I call. I wanted to initially write a book, not a podcast, but that was too difficult for me. And I tried to navigate like speech to text. I was just like, why don't I just try a podcast? It'd be fine. And here we are. But Uncomfortable Friend really was, I think initially I thought to myself, gosh, so many people make these big like faux pas when you're in grief, where they say the things that like are really painful. And I'm like, what if I'm like an uncomfortable friend that I'm going to help tell people like, you know what? Don't say you're still young, you can have more kids. Like that's a not a good thing to say to somebody, right? Like, and so initially I thought it was going to be about that. Like I'm going to be your friend that's going to be willing to talk to you about like uncomfortable topics. Um, but then I think as I thought about the show and as I did my recording of like my story as my first episode, I recognized that I just wanted to normalize a lot of what I was feeling. So then I shared my show, which was the hardest, my story. I know you did your story too. I'm curious to know if that was your hardest. And then I'm like, I'm going to go into anger because everybody's like so uncomfortable with anger. And I need people to know that this is okay. And so I don't know. I think it was just around, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, but there's also the gifts of the suffering and the gifts of what I've learned and how I've transformed it. And I can appreciate those gifts, even though I would give all of them back to have them back.
It's interesting that you say that too, because it's the challenge that I had. Like when I did that show, it was I think one of the very first solo shows that I did. So it was all my own voice, and I was struggling with that. I was like, oh God, like I want a chorus in here. I want something else, not just me. And I think that got me hung up a little bit, but it was also interesting because, and I'm not sure if you had this experience, but a lot of people like didn't know my story. They didn't know that I had been in this accident. They didn't know that I had this big scar on my leg. And that was very interesting for people to be like, oh, I didn't know that about you, and I'm wondering for you, was that something that you've experienced?
Yeah. Like nobody had ever heard, at least from my perspective, my whole story. Yeah. I went into a lot of it and I didn't go into like the aspects of my husband's because I'm like, that's not my story to tell. But a lot of people didn't know a lot of these details. And I think once they heard them, like I think the gravity of like, it's awful to lose anyone. Losing Lincoln was obviously the most difficult thing I've ever been through. But yeah, I think when you hear some of the details, you're just like, oh, like, I think that's where you get the compassion and the empathy for people. Like your heart just goes out for them.
So let's transition to work, because I know, as we said before, you love managing teams, and courage has been a core value for you and something that has really allowed you to show up in a way that is most meaningful for you at work. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So Lincoln was kind of like my impetus to wanting to be a manager. I just wanted to make an environment better for him. I had also had a couple of really bad managers, and I was actually almost let go from just having regular layoff cycles at work. It was just a really bad layoff cycle. And I had a different manager save me from that because they're just like, this is ridiculous. And I'm like, how can one manager see your potential and somebody not? And so, before I was an engineer and I loved it. It was my favorite job. That was the other thing that was really hard. I was being laid off of like my favorite job, which I'm now the senior manager of, which I think is really funny. But
I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah. But it really made me think to myself, like, either I can leave or I can try to be part of the solution, because I know I can at least be better than this last person. And so it really pushed me to want to try to be a manager. And it was, I think, 3 or 4 days after Lincoln passed, I got a call offering me a manager job at work. I had been interviewing for a few months before that or whatever. And then they just happened to call me a few days after. And I'm like, can I think about it? Like, I couldn't even process like any of that. Right. So, I thought to myself, well, I don't know what life looks like, but there was a bit of control that you get back. So when something really awful happens, I understand now why some people go right back to work. And it's because it allows you to have some semblance of control and safety in your life, because you've just lost all of it for this traumatic event. Yeah. And so, I mean, I was out for about 2 weeks. My husband took 2 months. He had a better policy on that than I did. But I remember I'm like, okay, I'll go back to work. And I made my decision. I said I was going to do it. And that was the beginning of me deciding that if I'm doing this, I'm doing this, because what's the worst that can happen? Like, they're going to fire me. A, already tried to, and somehow I got saved. But B, I'm like, I think I've already had the worst thing happen to me that could ever happen. And so what's the deal? I'm just going to go for it. And it was through, I think that I realized, like, I don't know what it's going to look like to be a manager. But I had to figure out like my own North Star for figuring out how was I going to navigate it. And at this point in time, I was really it was right around Lent. And I grew up Catholic. And I was reading the New Testament during Lent, the whole like New Testament. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I just want to love like Jesus, like regardless of what you think of him, like, you know, what a beautiful idol of a person of like how to just show what love looks like to people. And I remember that was some of the first experiences being a manager, and I'm thinking to myself, how do I love Carl? Like, I'm like, there's really difficult people at work, and I'm like, how do I love Carl? And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I need some grace for myself. Like, let me love myself. Let me love my family. Like, maybe the rest of my life is to love the Carls. But it helped me to pause for a second and think about how can I show up for him in a different environment, right? Like, what is he used to? And it allowed me to start talking to people, and really, I've gotten really good at being able to read their energy. I can read when their voices change. I can read when they're really excited or passionate about something versus not. And it allows me to really ask some deeper questions to really get to A, meaningful conversation, but B, really suss out their core values and work towards aligning it more to what we have to do to accomplish at work. Because imagine if you're doing the things that you're naturally good at and you have strengths in, and they're aligning with a core value of yours, you're going to be in a flow and you're going to feel great waking up every day coming to work. And that's the experience. Like, that's on the best day, that's the best thing I get to do as a manager by far.
It's so great that you're doing it not only for yourself, but that you have that, like, that additional sense, right? Like that keyed up sense, it sounds like, where you're really able to read people well, and that you're able to really anchor on what is important to them and adapt to it as well, and meet them where they are. Because as you said, you had a boss that was not good and didn't appreciate what you brought to the table. So it sounds like maybe that increased your superpower too, in addition to all of the other experiences, just as far as what you're able to pick up on and prioritizing it.
Mm-hmm. I think a really big thing that I learned too was the whole concept of however you call it, but the let go and let God. That's actually a really big thing for me, because I remember I became a manager in July, and at the end of the year, I had to do my first set of performance reviews, and previous managers had given everybody exceeds expectations. They're all great, right? And I felt like that was a cop-out to not have to have the difficult conversations. And I still feel this way. But to me, I really tried to figure out, how do I give appropriate feedback? Because that is an investment in someone. I'm going to try to do that multiple times. And some people are not going to be receptive, and that's fine. In which case I try to offer solutions, whether it be a mentor outside of my organization, or if I figure out where they might align, like having them do informational interviews for maybe a different place, you know, in case they want to try a different rollout. And so, you know, you got to be careful with how much energy you're putting into a lot of folks. But for me, it was really around, okay, like, how do I go in to have these performance conversations? And I'd have my notes, and I would pause like 5 minutes beforehand. I'd breathe. Please let my intent come through. Like, please let the positive intent of what I'm about to say come through. And that's where I started kind of leaning on like the continue, consider model whenever I give feedback. And the continue is the best part. And I tell them that. I'm like, it's the part where I get to tell you all the amazing things that you do. And then the consider is, I'm like, flat out, I'm going to tell you it's subjective. I'm like, it's going to be different for any manager that you possibly have. I'm like, but these are the things I'm hearing you tell me. These are the areas that I feel like you have interest. And here are some things that you might be able to do to bridge the gap to get to whatever it is that you want. Maybe they want to go down a technical fellow path. Maybe they want to get into management. Maybe they want to get their next promotion, you know, whatever it is. I try to help to figure out what are the things that they would like to do to bridge those gaps. And then it makes performance at the end of the year a little bit easier, because for me, it's like, well, did you do any of the things that we said consider? No? Okay. Like, I mean, it's fair. You don't have to take what I'm doing, but what was your experiment? Like, you know, and I instead of getting furious, I get curious. I heard that quote and I thought that was great. Get curious, not furious. And I'm like, what did you try? Because I don't want to just say like, well, you didn't do what I told you to do. I'm like, well, what else did you try? Did you do something different? Like, what do I not know? You know, my last question I usually ask in a performance review usually is like, what am I missing? Like, what did I not see? You know, and that's really lovely, because sometimes I am missing something, and that's a really good check on me. And sometimes I've noticed way more than they did, and they're shocked, because I remember one person, I told them, I'm like, did you know that you've trained 21 people this year? And they're like, well, I didn't even realize that. I'm like, that's significant, right? Like, and so those moments are kind of cool too, to help somebody recognized something that they just took for granted in themselves, but that you can show real appreciation for. So again, it's the stopping this moment of like, how do I love this person? You know, how am I honest about the fact that it's subjective? And then also, what am I missing?
I love that last question. What am I missing? Because it's just, it allows them to speak up for what they want, or maybe what has been overlooked. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of my favorite questions is, what is one thing that hasn't been said that needs to be said?
Ooh, that's a good one.
I mean, not just, I haven't done that in a performance review, but I've done it in meetings, like hard meetings or conversations, or just to make sure that people are able to bring something to the table that maybe we didn't get to. And that doesn't mean maybe we're going to tackle it in that moment, but you know, it's just, it's not like speak now or forever hold your peace. But it's like, while we're here, we have the opportunity to maybe bring something up that maybe we'll talk about later, but I think it's just building that psychological safety too. And I love that idea of continue consider, because it's not directive, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the challenges is that, like you said, instead of getting furious, getting curious, the idea of, well, this is what I would recommend to you. This is what I want to encourage for you, but it isn't necessarily what you're going to choose to do.
Yeah, I think that's where guilt started coming up for me, because I was trying to figure out, if somebody wasn't doing what I recommended, how do I help them? How do I connect them to a person, a role model, a mentor, whatever, an advocate, a sponsor, you know, because they're very different roles, to help them continue to grow. And I think personal growth is definitely a core value of mine. And so I encourage it in others. And when people don't act upon it, it definitely goes against my personal values and it makes me feel a little gross. But I had to be really careful of how much energy I then put into that. Because if it's somebody who isn't taking you up on those opportunities, not taking you up on your advice, not taking you up on opportunities to meet others and to continue to grow, I'm like, that's cool. That means that we just don't vibe together, and that's fair. And I had to learn that was okay, because it feels bad as a manager. Like, you want to help everyone. And I think it takes some courage to recognize that that's not going to be the case. And sometimes you're going to deplenish your energy that could be used for a greater good and multiplied in one area. And it's about, like, there's courage around releasing the guilt of that. And I am a huge advocate for that. Again, probably why we gravitate to Brene Brown, like this whole concept of guilt and shame. Like, once I was able to kind of start working toward reducing that from my vocabulary and not feeling it internally on myself, and realizing that in people, I make a mistake, like, it's fine, like, own it up, like, it's really freed me up. And so it's so funny, because I see so much fear around people being wrong or making the wrong decision or not knowing what to do. And I'm like, I tried to advocate for the fact that I'm like, you got to experiment, try something. And it could really fail, and that's fine. The first year after Lincoln died, his first birthday, my family was just like, what would you like us to do to honor him? You know? And I'm like, well, he loved animals. So I'm like, go and see some animals or something, right? Like, that's what I came up with. And that day I was just getting so many texts and pictures of people that are happy, like at zoos and all this other stuff. And I'm like, oh, this sucks, to be quite honest. Like, it hurt. I had to put my phone down for the rest of the day. I just couldn't handle it. Mm-hmm. And I remember telling my friend that I'm like, wow, that was the wrong thing to do. And she was just like, but you told me to do it. I'm like, and I was wrong. Like, I don't know what I need. Like, I'm guessing here. Like, yeah. So it takes courage to experiment, right? But I learned that I don't ask for that now. And I've learned through that journey what kinds of things do bring me comfort. And I've learned to now have language around that and to be vulnerable and open about what I need, and then be really, really grateful when people are willing to step out of their own comfort zone and provide that.
It sounds so wonderful that you are really encouraging people to make mistakes at work as well. And the idea of getting rid of the fear of failure or the fear of looking stupid, and that, which is so, so common.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you know what we do, I'm a senior manager in aerospace, and we do flight tests on experimental aircraft, and that is an inherently dangerous profession. And so there's some things that we can't make mistakes on, right? But there are things around failure, around to meet a due date. Not to say that we're always going to miss our dates or whatever, but if we're missing a due date because we're doing some due diligence on risk management and unintended consequences and all of that, that's super important. Those are things that we need to be elevating. And but I still see such a pushback to wanting to take that chance. It's well, just tell me what we should be doing, right? And it's just like, well, that's not for me. And so when I see the folks on my team who are in the arena, as Renee says, I champion them for as loud as I possibly can. I think it's the greatest thing ever. And I hope that shows people that I mean it when I say that. And I've had a few people who have made like very small mistakes, right? Like simple, like, oh, I forgot to process my travel like information on time. And now I got they got like a nasty gram and they're sorry or whatever. And I'm like, all right, well, what did we learn? Like, like I'm not like, how could you, like, you're not going on travel ever again? Or, like, I'm like, it's been fun to watch them come to me with a little bit of fear and having to own up for the thing that they've done. And it's been so fun to be able to give them the grace to be like, you're enough. Like, you're fine. Like, yeah, you made a mistake. And guess what? You're not going to process those late ever again now. So that was a very valuable training. Like, I think the worst thing you can do is if somebody messes up is to take them off of the project or take them out of the environment that they were just in. Yeah, it's embarrassing for sure. But the person who messes up in a public way will never mess up with that thing ever again. So for me, that is the most valuable training we can possibly provide.
It also sounds like you're a very empowering manager where you're saying to people, what did you learn from this? And you're also not rescuing them at the same time. You're not doing it on their behalf the next time.
Ooh, although, I think some of that nurturing motherly instinct is definitely wanting to rescue. And so that I've had to navigate as a manager to learn like, okay, that's not how I would do it, but go ahead. Tell me what happens. Like, and the more I'm able to try it, the easier it gets. But sometimes you're just like, oh, I've seen that movie. I know how it ends. It's not going to be good. And I try not to let anybody get into such a painful thing. But recently, maybe like a year ago, somebody was kind of going down that path. And I'm like, I've done everything in my power to try to stop that. And, it ended up happening not under me, but under somebody else. And yeah, they made a pretty big mistake. And I hope that they were able to learn from that and grow from that, because that's all we can do. I, for one, know that I never want to be judged for the things I did and said in my 20s for the rest of my life. And so regardless of whether they make the mistake or not, I'm here to love them anyway. So.
You are a very generous person. And as we come up to time in the conversation, I mean, I'd love to, a few things that I'm walking away with is your true generosity. I mean, you've been through a lot and you have honored that for other people too. And instead of turning it into something that is just anger and taking you into a well that you don't want to be in, you are using it for the power to multiply the talents of other people, to bring grace, to bring love. It's a phenomenal thing, and it is rare. So I want to acknowledge you for that, and thank you for a really wonderful conversation, April.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that. And I will say that's a gift that Lincoln taught me. I joke that my children have, turned me, into from the Grinch. Like, my heart has grown with each child I've had. So my heart has grown 3 sizes. I didn't know the capacity I had to love until I had Lincoln. And I just know that I have more of it to give, and I know that it will never take the place of any other person in my heart. There's always going to be a little bit of a Lincoln-sized hole in my heart. And I remember being so afraid that when I had Ada, I wasn't going to be able to love her as much as I love Lincoln. And I didn't know that my heart was going to grow. And so for how lovely that comment was about grace, it gives me so much back as well. And we definitely need more of it. And thank you so much again for having me here. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Roger Kastner, for introducing us. Roger, if you're listening.
I bet you he is.
I bet he is too. Keep doing all of the amazing things that you do. Thank you. And I'm glad that you're not only on the show, but now you are in my larger life. So thank you.
Me too.
Well, everybody, a beautiful show. Thank you for listening. Stay courageous. The Courage Effect is brought to you by Weller Collaboration. If you're looking to enhance your leadership skills or get more comfortable with change, please reach out to us. Our team of coaches, advisors, and consultants would love to help you get out of your comfort zone, operate in a braver brain space, and achieve even more amazing results. More information about Weller Collaboration is available in the show notes. Please spread the word about the Courage Effect. Rate and review on your favorite podcast platform, and we would love for you to share with your colleagues, family, or anyone in your universe who could use a good dose of courage. If you have feedback or would like to apply to be a guest, please reach out to us via our website, thecourageeffect.com. Lanny Mathers is our producer. Dave Nelson composed our theme music. Alex Sandyforth is our administrative maven, and I'm your host, Suzanne Weller.